Dave Wasserman, thanks for joining us on the Fireside Chat.
Sure.
So, Dave, we have been seeing a lot of polls over recent months showing that Joe Biden is really struggling to gain the support of younger voters, whereas former President Trump is doing comparatively well, certainly for a Republican candidate. First of all, I wonder, do you believe those polls that you're seeing? And if so, how do you explain them?
I do believe these polls that we're seeing that show Joe Biden unusually weak with young voters, because the truth is there's never been a lot of young enthusiasm for Joe Biden. It's mostly been enthusiasm against Donald Trump. And the problems, the weakness that we've been seeing predate October 7th. And the war in Gaza has driven a wedge between Biden and the young progressive voters that he's going to need to ultimately vote against Trump. It's made it harder for Biden to get back to his 2020 levels of performance. And the exit polls 4 years ago showed that Biden carried voters 18 to 29 years of age 60 to 36% by 24 points. In our latest average of the crosstabs in these polls, Biden is only leading Trump 49 to 40%. That's not going to cut it, particularly in these key battleground states with higher numbers of younger participants.
Dave, we've seen in some polls that Israel's pretty unpopular amongst young voters, but then there are other polls, like, say, the Harvard Youth Poll, which suggests that Israel's actually a low-level issue for young voters. So which is it? Does the Gaza issue impact the youth support for Biden or not?
Yes, and Democrats are pointing to several polls that say that perhaps only 13 to 15% of young voters consider the situation in Gaza to be their top issue. But for that 13 to 15%, it could be a considerable depressing effect for support for Biden, and could make the difference between the numbers that Biden needs or not. And let's say that third-party candidates, whether it's RFK Jr. or more anti-war protest candidates, such as Jill Stein, or simply movements to write in the words ceasefire on the ballot rather than voting for a major party candidate. Let's say they take even 3 or 4% of the vote in places like Madison, Wisconsin, or Ann Arbor, Michigan, or Tempe, Arizona, in these college towns with big university populations that are progressive. That seriously precludes Biden from getting to his victory number in those critical states.
Dave, you talk about Joe Biden having always struggled to attract younger voters, but back in 2020, we did see record youth voter turnout in many parts of the country. Are you suggesting that both Biden and Trump may struggle to get younger voters out to the polls this year?
The key in 2020 was that it was more of a referendum on Trump, who was at a 41% approval rating after being widely perceived by voters to have mishandled COVID. And it wasn't really an election about Joe Biden. He was more of a transitional figure to move on from the chaos of the Trump era. Now, this is more of a choice election where voters have had a side-by-side comparison of the two candidates. And even though Joe Biden has made overtures to young voters on student loan forgiveness and climate change, keep in mind that a number of young voters are more culturally moderate or conservative, and some of them did not go to college. And we are seeing, I think, on the economy and pocketbook issues, voters across generations, including young voters, have more favorable perceptions of what the economy was like and what things cost under Trump's presidency than under Biden's. The saying here is that a $5 foot-long sandwich at Subway has become a $6 6-inch. And to voters who are more simplistically comparing the two administrations and what they meant for their ability to obtain a mortgage, to buy their first home, or simply the cost of groceries or gas or healthcare, a number of voters are willing to overlook Trump's behavior and legal problems and indictments to go back to what the economy was like and what they remember about it under Trump's 4 years.
Okay, that's young voters. But a number of polls have shown Biden making significant inroads into Trump support amongst over 65s. Do you think that's real? And if so, why might that be?
You know, the polls in 2020 also showed that Biden was performing relatively well with seniors. In the end, the evidence suggests that Biden and Trump ran evenly. Now, there were some trends that polls picked up in 2020 that were borne out in the results. For example, Trump performing much better with Hispanic and Latino voters. That was detected by pre-election surveys in 2020 and ended up being true. So what we're looking at in 2024, in our average of polls, Biden and Trump are running roughly evenly among seniors. And that is not much of a shift from what the exit polls showed 4 years ago. Biden's support appears to be holding up relatively well among older voters and with white voters. But basically, all of the erosion in Biden's support in the last 4 years appears to be coming from young voters and voters of color. The good news for Biden is that these are voters that he has won before and has a chance to bring back into the fold over the course of the next 6 months. But there's no guarantee it's going to happen. And he's pretty far off the mark of where he needs to be.
So these shifting demographics, Dave, are they just happening sort of around the margins, or are we seeing a fairly fundamental realignment of what age groups and what other demographics are supporting the two major parties?
These days, you can't just look at American politics on a left versus right spectrum. There's another axis that is important to pay attention to, and that's the engagement axis: high engaged voters versus low levels of more peripherally engaged voters. And what we're seeing is that Joe Biden and Democrats are doing best with the voters who are more reflexively paying attention to politics, those with higher levels of civic and institutional trust. It explains why Democrats have done very well in special elections and off years and midterm elections. But where Donald Trump and Republicans are getting their support are from voters who are more distrustful of institutions and are less frequent and reliable voters. And this pattern is true across age ranges and across ethnicities. And so I actually think Joe Biden's best case scenario this fall would be a lower turnout election where we see a significant drop off in turnout of particularly non-college educated white voters relative to 2020. And the best case scenario for Trump might be that we see a large turnout where a number of voters who aren't that ideological or politically engaged turn out.
And are you seeing indications so far as to whether this should be a high turnout election or a low turnout election?
You know, what I can predict is that the turnout this fall will be closer to 2020 than it was in 2022, but probably not higher than the 160 million Americans who cast ballots in 2020. Keep in mind that when Trump was in the White House, he was the great polarizer. And he not only motivated a lot of Republicans to vote, but he also made Democrats so angry that we had historic levels of turnout on both sides. 159.6 million voters cast ballots that year. We only had 112 million Americans who cast ballots in the midterms when Democrats gained a seat in the Senate and Republicans gained 9 seats in the House. It was basically a wash. And so I think we're going to see between 140 and 155 million Americans turn out this year. And good news for Biden, that's a little bit less than it was in 2020. The good news for Trump is that it's a lot more than it was in 2022. And what we're seeing is that among these less frequent voters, Trump has more of an advantage.
And of course, Dave, in defining high turnout versus low turnout, that also includes high or low turnout for third-party candidates. And if they get high turnout, it lowers the turnout for the major too. So how do you imagine that is going to play out into the overall turnout picture?
Well, we have the 2 least popular nominees since 2016. And what that means is about 20% of voters have negative views of both candidates. We call these voters the Doubledowners. And there is disillusionment with the 2-party system that is driving many of them towards third-party candidates. In some surveys, RFK Jr. is getting as much as 15 or 17% of the vote when he's included as an option on the survey. Third-party candidates altogether might be getting around 20%. But what we know based on history, as you get closer to election day, that third party vote collapses as voters realize that because of our electoral college system, this is really a binary choice, and anything other than a vote for Trump or Biden equates to throwing your vote away. As best we can tell, RFK Jr. is taking roughly evenly from Biden and Trump. It's those anti-war protest candidates on the left, whether it's Jill Stein or Cornel West, that could pose more of a threat to Joe Biden by siphoning young progressive voters who not only didn't love him to begin with, they were with Bernie Sanders in the primaries in 2020, but they also have deep concerns about the administration's approach to Israel's war with Hamas.
Now, Dave, we are starting to see quite a large gap opening up between likely voters who tend to support Biden and all adults who tend to support Trump more. But just how reliable are those likely voter models? Should we trust them as being definitely more reliable than the other numbers?
In the past, the truth has been somewhere between the likely voter sample and the all adult sample. There are some adults who are screened out of the likely voter sample who do end up voting. And in 2020, most of them voted, which I think explains why Donald Trump was able to outperform the polls. The polling averages in the run up to 2020 had Joe Biden ahead by 7 to 8 points. He won the popular vote by 4.5. And then in the tipping point state in the Electoral College, his margin was only 0.6 points. And so when I see national polls that say this race is tied, to me that equates to a narrow Trump advantage overall, not only because of the potential for an undersampling of Trump voters, but also because of the gap between the popular vote and the Electoral College.
And all those demographic numbers that we like to throw around when we talk polling, are they generally likely voter numbers or are they all adult voter numbers?
At this point, most of the national surveys are polling registered voters. As we get closer to November, you will see more polls that screen for likely voters based on their self-reported intention of voting. And that may lead to an uptick in Biden's standing in some of these surveys. But keep in mind, we are in the dark in many respects because response rates to polls that have a live interview component are down to less than 1%. So we're relying on 1% of people who are bored enough to talk to a pollster or not sophisticated enough to screen their calls to accurately model the attitudes of the other 99% of voters. And that raises the possibility of a non-response bias that benefits or skews the results towards one party. And every pollster is trying a different technique to try and correct for this. But no one can ultimately be 100% confident that their sample reflects the larger electorate.
And Dave Wasserman, this week, of course, marked 6 months until presidential election day. In the last two election cycles where Donald Trump has been on the ballot, he was behind Hillary Clinton at this point by about 10 percentage points. 4 years ago, he was behind Joe Biden by more than 5 percentage points. And so he staged a comeback in both cases, not enough to win, obviously, in 2020, but he was able to come back. I wonder how you interpret that. Is it something about Trump? Is it something about voter behaviour that saw a real tightening of the race in that final stretch?
What we've seen increasingly in American politics is that voters who may not like a candidate personally might still vote for them if they favor their policies. And keep in mind that there was a contingent of around 10% of the overall electorate who disliked Donald Trump personally, but was still willing to vote for him at the end of the day because they're fundamentally more conservative or they believed that Democrats had gone too far left on immigration or taxes. That component is still there. And in fact, the most recent New York Times Siena poll found that 53% of voters believe that Trump is guilty of committing serious federal crimes. But 18% of that 53% were planning on voting for him anyway. What I'm curious about is if we do see a conviction in the New York hush money payments trial, and he has the convicted felon label with him heading into the general election, do we see that 18% number collapse a little bit? Maybe that brings Joe Biden up 1 or 2 points on the margin relative to where he is today. But given how firm and entrenched voters' views of these two men are, it's very difficult for news developments or even paid advertising to move the needle very much.
Okay, let's talk about the Manhattan trial now. Have you seen enough polling evidence to convince you that this could have a potentially large impact on the race, especially in the case of a conviction, or is it starting to look like business as usual to you?
There are a variety of polls that ask voters whether their vote intention would change if Trump were convicted of a crime. And the answer is yes, the polls do change, but by a very slight amount. Now, that slight amount may be all Joe Biden needs in a very, very close election. Even so, Biden is pretty far off the mark of where the polling average was 4 years ago. And what I see when we look at these surveys regarding the trials, voters kind of conflate Trump's legal problems all together. And in a way, it's beneficial to Trump that there are 4 separate indictments that are difficult for voters to keep track of, particularly voters who are not mainlining cable news or paying a lot of attention to political news every day. And in fact, even Democrats would acknowledge that legally, the hush money payments trial in Manhattan is the weakest case against Trump, the one that voters regard as the least serious of the indictments he's been charged with. Even so, it's the only trial that may end up taking place between now and November.
And Dave, I wonder, from what you're seeing in the polls, just how big a liability do you think Joe Biden's age is? Some Democrats are convinced that given his record, generally positive as they see it, if he was 61 rather than 81, he would be sailing to re-election, particularly against somebody like Donald Trump. Is age the reason why this is a very close contest?
I think it's less so his age, given that he is only 4 years older than Donald Trump. And it's more his inability to be a forceful communicator. Now, Democrats and the White House will fondly point out that Joe Biden is capable of rising to the occasion in big moments, such as the State of the Union address, which was a forceful campaign speech. But Biden does not have the capability or the green light from those at the White House who are planning his schedule to prosecute the case against Trump every single day. And I do think there may be a missed opportunity here for Joe Biden strategically. You know, the White House and Democrats are trying to make this election about the abortion issue and Republican proposals to restrict abortion in a handful of key states and tie Trump to that effort. And clearly his appointment of 3 Supreme Court justices who overturned Roe v. Wade. But Democrats are risking whistling past not only the economy, but the issue of immigration, which Donald Trump is trying to make the centerpiece here. And Joe Biden could be hammering Trump on a daily basis for absolutely sabotaging the Senate immigration compromise that members of both parties hashed out that would have married a whole lot more money for border security and border patrol agents with a legal pathway for those who have recently arrived in America to work legally. It's a strategy that helped a Democrat win a key special election for Congress on Long Island in February. And yet Biden is not out there every day trying to make Trump own this legislative failure and to point the blame at him. Good candidates, much as good sports players, know how to turn defense into offense immediately. And we're seeing Democrats shy away from trying to turn an issue that's been their weakness into more of a neutral issue or a strength.
Finally, Dave, for years we've heard firm and fast rules about the value of presidential ratings, of people evaluating where they are compared to where they were 4 years ago, and about how satisfied people are with the direction of the country. Now, on all of those measures, Biden is doing abysmally. So does that mean that the rules no longer apply because the race seems competitive, or is the race not as competitive as it seems?
I think there's a weaker relationship between presidential approval and the economy. There's a weaker relationship between presidential approval and vote choice than there used to be, because we are in an era of negative partisanship. And what that means is that there are fewer persuadable voters than ever before. Most voters deeply dislike one of the two candidates. And even if Democrats are down on Joe Biden and independent voters are down on Joe Biden, not only because of concerns over high interest rates and the economy, not only the war between Israel and Hamas, but also even dating back to America's withdrawal from Afghanistan. That was the moment at which his disapproval really spiked and exceeded his approval. That was the moment his honeymoon period ended. But there are still voters who believe that he's too old to be president, who will nonetheless never vote for Donald Trump because they believe he doesn't have the temperament to serve as president, and that he is an extremist, particularly in light of January 6th and the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. So I do think that this is bound to be a close election no matter what. And regardless of whether Joe Biden's approval rating is at 47% or 41%, which is right about where it is today.
Dave Wasserman, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Fireside Chat.
Thank you.